In this video, we're going to look at a couple steps involved in upgrading your existing scheduled trigger actions. All of your trigger actions will be automatically upgraded when you do the upgrade, and any trigger actions besides the rescheduled trigger actions won't require any manual intervention. However, if you have scheduled trigger actions, you will need to make a few changes in order for the triggers to continue to function in version 3.0. Specifically, when the rescheduled event runs at a later date, you need to make some adjustments. Triggers have been completely rewritten in version 3 to be much easier to use. The big change with scheduled trigger actions is that the scheduled trigger action has its own set of child actions that run when the event runs. So if you schedule an event to run 3 days later, it will run, and only the child actions of that scheduled event will execute. This removes the need to create flags and set different update values to ensure that your other trigger actions don't run when the rescheduled event runs. So what I'm looking at right here is in version 2.0, I have this trigger set up, and I'm just going to go over what I have set up here and then show you what you need to do in version 3 to get it to function the same way. So basically, this is an automatic. I've got a trigger. It's called follow up after 3 days. It runs on insert. So as soon as a new record is inserted, this trigger is going to run. I've got a simple condition which always evaluates to true. So the trigger always runs when a new record is inserted. The rules execute in order. So the first rule runs and says send follow up email. This rule checks to see if it's already been scheduled by checking the is scheduled flag, and if it has already been scheduled and the user hasn't been contacted, then it sends the email. On the initial form submission, this rule will evaluate to false because the is scheduled flag hasn't been set yet. So we move on to the next rule, which says set the scheduled event. So this is the rule that will reschedule it to run in 3 days if it hasn't already been scheduled. The following rule is the one that sets the flag. It sets the flag to say is scheduled equals yes, so that when these triggers run again 3 days later, the first rule, the send follow up, checks the is scheduled flag, and if it is scheduled, which it will be when it runs 3 days later, it will then send the email. So it's a little bit confusing in version 2.0. So let's take a look at how this will upgrade to version 3.0 and what you'll need to do to ensure that your triggers continue to work. So switching to version 3.0 and logging in, I'm going to go to my insurance quote form and open up the triggers. And I've got my follow-up after 3 day trigger. And everything is the same. It executes, it runs on insert. We've got a new option to enable logging. So I'm going to turn that on, and that's a very powerful feature that's going to make developing triggers a lot easier. And then you've got your rules. These are the same rules as before. And we've got our actions. So these are the same 3 actions, but what's happened is the rules have been combined with the actions. These trigger actions run. And first the email action runs, and take a look at it. You can see it's got a rule that says if the user hasn't been contacted, if so is contacted equals no, and is scheduled equals yes. So if it's already been scheduled, then it's going to send the email. Now this action, we only want this action to run 3 days later when the scheduled event runs. So what we need to do is any actions that are associated with a rescheduled event, we want to move them into the scheduled trigger action. So right click on it and say transfer action to schedule reminder in 3 days. So that makes it a child of this action. And we can actually delete is scheduled completely because we don't need the flags in the data anymore, because this set of trigger actions is not going to run 3 days later. Only the trigger actions that are children of the scheduled event will run in 3 days. So let's just delete that action. And then let's take a look at the schedule reminder in 3 days. So now we just have the one trigger action. When the form gets submitted, this is going to run. It's going to run it's going to schedule another event to run in 3 days at 3 o'clock, and then these actions are going to execute. And the only action that we have is to send the follow-up. So let's take a look at that. Just your basic email follow-up to let them know that we haven't forgotten about them and that we're going to get in touch with them soon. So what we can do is, in this case, we can delete the is scheduled equals yes flag because we don't need to check for that anymore, because we know that if this runs, it's running 3 days later. It will never run initially. It'll only run as part of a child action of the rescheduled event. So we can get rid of that filter, but let's keep the contacted equals no. And that's for if an agent follows up with this person before the 3 days, they can set the contacted flag to true or to yes, and that will avoid the email being sent 3 days later. So we can simply save that and click finish, and click finish, and finish again. So that's the only update that you need to make, is basically moving the actions that you want to have run at the rescheduled event date inside the rescheduled event action. Now let's just take a look at how that will work. So I'm going to open up the insurance quote form. It's a very simple form. We'll just say Mike test developer support, Mike at logiforms.com. That's an 838-3202-3203, and submit. Okay, so the form's been submitted. Now let's take a look at the log for the trigger action, and just click on view debugging log. So now we have this log. This replaces the trigger debug field that you've been used to using in version 2 if you were debugging your triggers, and this will give you a complete rundown of when your triggers execute. It'll also show you after the rescheduled event executes. So here we go. We've got trigger starting in insert mode, skipping the initial rule state check, the change state rule matches, one trigger action found, matched, and schedule reminder in 3 days, and basically that's it. It's been scheduled now for 3 days. So now there's an event that will run in 3 days, and when that runs, it will simply call the rescheduled event, which is the trigger that got called to reschedule the event, and then it'll go through the actions of that event and take those actions. And so that's really all there is to upgrading your triggers from version 2 to version 3, and it's only the triggers that have the rescheduled events that need to be modified. And the key thing is that you'll move the events that you want deferred inside the trigger action, the rescheduled trigger action, so that they run at a later date. And you'll probably want to remove the rule references to flags and things like that. So hopefully that clears it up. If you have any questions, feel free to contact support. They can also look over your triggers and make sure everything is updated correctly.